I need to start this introduction to our unit on the effects of disease on arts and literature by asking my colleague, Dr. Craig Oberg of the Microbiology Department here at Weber State University, what's with the sunglasses?
Hey, Gene. Well, this is the one on arts, so I wanted to look cool. I wanted to look like a beat poet of the 60s. Is it working?
Well, you do look beat.
Okay, I'll put on my old sinus glasses then.
You know, this has been a particularly challenging unit for me, Craig. I don't know about you, but as we've worked on this one, it's kind of a moving target. When we talk about the effect of disease on warfare or politics, we can kind of get the cause and effect pretty well lined up. When you deal with the effects on arts and literature, things are a little more amorphous. I think the only place where you can really have a definitive idea about how it affected art and literature has to do with the early demise of folks. And as a result of that, the works that they did not produce that we'll never see or hear, which is terribly tragic. Other than that, it's very difficult in many cases to discern the effects of disease on art and literature.
Well, I concur, Gene. I mean, there's very little, as a scientist, we're always interested in cause and effect, and that's harder to see. But I think there is one area, what piqued our interest initially was looking at the effect of AIDS on the entertainment industry in the United States when it first came out in the 1980s, the incredible impact that it had. And then to begin to investigate other areas where disease might have had an effect on literature, on painting, on the arts, on theater. And those kinds of things I think are out there. But you're right, it's more tenuous. There's less documentation, and so I think in a way it makes it funner because it's more mysterious.
Yeah, I'm recalling, Craig, the very first time years ago, you and I talked about the tragedy of Howard Ashman, the lyricist, The Little Mermaid, Aladdin, other Disney features, had passed away from AIDS at a very young age of 40. And that led us to begin to think about things like tuberculosis during the Victorian era, where so many of the great writers were afflicted with tuberculosis. And some of them died incredibly young. The great poet John Keats at the age of 21. And from there, our thinking kind of spread. And so we thought this was an important aspect of our whole discussion on the effect of disease on history.
Yeah, and I think the other interesting aspect of this unit is to think about things like tuberculosis and HIV. HIV is the emerging disease that really set the public health world back on its heels, thinking that they were going to control everything. And so it's not only interesting to me to think about its effect on the arts, but also to have these diseases come back up. And you mentioned tuberculosis, which is now considered probably the preeminent re-emerging disease. And so these things kind of entwine, and hopefully in this unit you'll see that some of the connections that we've seen, and maybe you'll find some others also.
And in connection with AIDS, Craig, as a historian, I've been particularly interested in how we might think of the AIDS epidemic beginning in the 1980s as the sexual counter-revolution. I mean, there are bigger issues here. And we suddenly begin to hear things like safe sex. These are huge social issues that spread rapidly out from our consideration of a subject like HIV and AIDS. And by looking at how it affected the entertainment industry, we begin to get a little doorway into those discussions.
Yeah, I think you're right. HIV is a nice picture of maybe what happened in the Victorian period with syphilis and its effect on all sorts of aspects of life, including the arts. So,
yeah, you've mentioned before how syphilis really was the cause of what we think of as Victorian morality, as the Victorians began to be nervous about their sexual behavior. So in a very interesting way, 100 years later, we wind up with the same kind of situation with regard to HIV. We also began to talk about STDs back in the days of Shakespeare, the Elizabethan era, and how interesting they were as so ubiquitous in the literature at the time. And so we found ourselves a little more nervous about the cause and effect, but certainly finding some very fascinating information about the effect of disease in these areas.
Yeah, exactly. We hope you enjoy the unit.